thank you all for being here, for listening to my presentation. And this is my PhD topic, transition towards adequate access to basic services in developing cities. And in this context, I'm exploring the user perspective. And the empirical context is Nairobi, the city of Nairobi, and specifically I'm looking at sanitation. I'm towards the end of my second year of my PhD, so I'm really towards the end, so really a lot of input. I need to, And I'm an external PhD student of Utrecht University in the Netherlands. I'm based at Eawag in Switzerland. So the motivation of my PhD is the challenges of informal settlements, and in regards to basic services, and that is water, sanitation, solid waste management. And I don't need to really go too much into this because you can see the first citation is Suzanne. So that's a really good paper to show these the challenges of informal settlements. And in this context, the thing is that for many decades, the more formal and mostly centralized sanitation or water services provision was not provided because it was seen as illegal areas in the city. And with these, of course, other alternatives had to be in place for people to be able to manage their everyday needs for water and sanitation. And this led to the existence of unsafe options, which were always very unsustainable economically or in many other dimensions. And also these systems are quite diverse. It's not like there's two other alternatives for toilet use apart from the centralized. There's like very many different technologies and business models on how to provide. Some of them are provided by individuals and some of them by entrepreneurs, local entrepreneurs or people who come to leverage on this space. And of course, this also is made complex by the fact that informal settlements, there's a lot of institutional challenges, economic, infrastructure, demographic, social factors. It makes the whole system very complex. And of course, it's driven by the fact that sanitation is one of the development challenges that is really not progressing fast and in urban areas, especially with the fact that there's high urbanization going on. And in the context of my PhD, I'm interested to understand why there's all these innovations come in and all these alternatives to the centralized system are introduced into the informal settlements. Some of them are formalized in form of with probably private entrepreneurs, but some of them really don't get embedded. People don't. It has not reached a point where these systems are taken as business as usual solutions rather than short-term alternative options. And there are very interesting, promising opportunities, especially the on-site toilets, which they're very keen, these innovators are very keen on reducing health impacts, and they do, for example, on-site treatment of waste, so that, which it's definitely something that can be seen as solution on a informal settlement scale, promising solution. And like I mentioned, these opportunities, successes are very few, and the reason is because there's really high degree of this complexity that I discussed. So I just have two pictures of some examples to kind of give you a picture when I talk about this on-site solution. That's it's a container-based system whereby, well, it can be used in that way, and every day the fecal waste can be collected by a social entrepreneur who transforms it into manure or biogas. There are very many different innovative ideas around that. And that's also another innovator who showed up also with her own idea, and it's called Ditegeme, and it's just interesting to already show that they use it for a while and they now use it for storing. They find it better to use it as a storage rather than as a toilet. With these complexities, the objectives of my PhD, first of all, is to understand, to conceptualize these complexities in the basic service sectors of developing cities, to try to give a holistic picture of how it can be described with all these multidimensional aspects that influence it. And after this conceptualization, I want to analyze the challenges and opportunities for embedding some technologies that seem useful, meaningful in this context. And with that also, I want to look at some actors, and myself specifically, I'm looking at the demand side, because the demand side size in this context seem to have some kind of significant influence or role in the sector. So the focus is not on who's the provider, but like from the demand side, to try to check, to analyze the systems of service access. Yeah. So I'm grounding my conceptual approaches on sustainability transitions that at least Anna already introduced a bit of it, and the reason why I decided to go for the sustainability transition, why I found it interesting, is because of its strengths, especially in dealing with highly complex, multidimensional, multi-scale, and persistent problems. And with that, I apply these a number of some of the frameworks that have been formalized in there, and there's a socio-technical regime concept, there's technological innovation systems that was already introduced a little bit, and grassroots innovation. And I also try to make sense of this situation using the practice theory, which is also a different, a community of researchers who are also trying to find the linkages to sustainability transition. A little has been done, so I'm exploring it. It's useful in my context. A little bit about the data. So I really prefer to show these because later probably I would be interested to hear your thoughts about generalization, or at what level can I claim that these facts are useful and to follow something like that. So in the case study was Nairobi 3 informal settlements, and one of them is where Suzanne will be exploring, and I think it would be very interesting to kind of learn what you find in there. It's called Mathare, and there's Mukuru and Kahawa Soweto. I interviewed 30 households, and the interview was, I would say, almost ethnographic, because I spent an average of 2 hours or so with one family, and not on the same day, on 2 different days, and this incorporated a little bit of like open-ended questionnaires and observation, and a little bit of a walk to show me where they use these services. And also, initially, before the interviews, I did some focus group discussion to kind of have a picture of the informal settlements, and at the end of the interviews, I also did some focus group discussions. Yeah, and to complement these, I did interviews with experts. And that is local experts, local informants, community leaders, and also professional experts. And yeah, data management by Max QDM. So I'm still working on my findings, but some of the preliminary things that are coming out from this research is that, first of all, me and a colleague of mine, whom we're working together in the project, we decided to, first of all, have a paper together, and it's to conceptualize how the sanitation sector looks like, and where I come in is the idea that, or rather why this paper fits into my package of output, is that this paper conceptualizes this heterogeneous system of service access, which, yeah, of course, includes the diverse technologies, diverse business models, and diverse user practices, and what's the interplay, and how can it be best described? And we conceptualize what we call as a splintered regime. And here also we say that users are key actors in the sector. And After that, the other 3 papers are of my own, focusing on the user, and here we show, and some of the things that are coming out is on, for example, path dependencies, where we find that it's really not about a technology and its functionality. Sometimes it's about competing needs, and already what I'm trying to develop further on these, to make this an output, is the fact that first of all, there are many service options that exist every day, and in the case of these informal settlements in Nairobi, they're not always consistent. So people end up using more than one option in a day, more than 5 alternatives in a week. So it's there's really no consistency in the service provisioning. And then there's also the informal economies where people's income are not also consistent. So, and in this regard, they use the option that they're able to afford. Sometimes they have the feeling that they would like to use the best alternative, the most hygienic, but when it's when they don't have money, they tend to kind of use these other alternatives, and they have a lot of innovative strategies around access, which includes negotiation with the neighbors and friends and providers. And then there is navigating, and I categorize this with coping strategies, where it's at night, for example, you cannot go out, you have to find a solution. And then there is also a lot of contravention, where they really break a toilet because there's a toilet next to you but you cannot access because of some social dynamics. And these kinds of strategies, I try to kind of organize it in an interesting way that shows the complexities. The other interesting findings is about embedding. Embeddings, to me, I find like it's a very long-term process, and this relates to the finding here in South Africa, where you say they say no to these alternatives. But in the case of these informal settlements in Nairobi, they accept a lot of options. They quickly accept, and they're like, and also they're very, very interested to try new things. But it's really not about. I can say it's because of 2 things. One thing is because they're really eager to stabilize their sanitation access. They're looking for simple options rather than these using many options. But secondly, there's the issue whereby over a long period of time where interventions have always been brought to them, they tend to accept options because they think it might lead to them being part of a project or things like this. So it really becomes actually a methodological challenge when you collect data, because they seem to talk very well about about many innovations. And but also the other thing, I think on experimentation, maybe it's very important also to learn that also these people in their context, sometimes they really don't know what will work for them. So these experiments really need to come in, and they can be able to interact with them to really know if it fits to their everyday life, it fits to this whole context. And in this also research, it really brought out why and how the demand side actors play a role in shaping this sanitation regime. And some of the, in what ways, for example, co-production, you find, for example, most of the public toilet, which is the most used option in many informal settlements, are run by community groups. And this leads to a different kind of dynamic, especially at this point when the local government is interested to explore informal settlements. So they become sort of the regime in this context, because they've provided services for the last 40 years. They've developed a kind of structure around it. It's connected to their livelihood, so they really create this resistance because this is their space, sort of. And also, it also brought out the complex bundling of sanitation practices and other practices in the everyday life. And it also, of course, brought out these informal economies, how it influences sanitation access. I put some slides on some issues that we were told to think about, and I found them very useful for me. and one of them was about policy and business relevance. And generally, I would put it like, from my experience, or rather from what's coming out from the research, is that the users need to be more considered in basic service arrangements. And with this, like a lot of time when it's about basic service provision, it's you will hear it's about, well, providers have to work together to organize themselves in certain ways, and behavior change has to be considered. When it comes to the user, the idea is only behavior change, but they're really part of the service provisioning, and this has to be considered. And also the ideas of Anna already mentioned that these sectors can be very complex, and simplification just to make things move is always the easy way to go, but maybe just more thought into what are the complexities, how is sanitation connected to other services? Yeah, it's not only maybe econometrics approach or behavior change approach, but all these things are connected. And on knowledge transfer, I try to think about it, and I'm really thinking about conceptual contribution would be the idea that sustainability transition is a young field that is growing, and the degree of, and it's mostly developed from a very OECD context where complexities are less. And perhaps it's interesting to see like that I explore the same frameworks in a more complex setting. What does it bring to the framework, and what kind of extent can improve knowledge about transitions? And the second one is about probably there are those globally shared sustainability challenges like climate change, and what would it mean about sustainability transition in both contexts? And knowledge transfer from theory to practice, it's a question I ask myself every day, because first of all, I worked with community members, and I wonder how this research would give something back to them as source of knowledge for me. And also the practitioners, because sort of these, my publications tend to be conceptual, and I'm thinking how to give back to, or rather have it available for practitioners, and perhaps publishing in policy-oriented outlets. That's what I'm thinking about. And continuous interaction with the people I interviewed on the ground. So those are somehow how I intend to organize my papers. The first one is the one that we try to describe the sector, both providers and users, and then another one I look at the agency of the grassroots groups, and there's the everyday practices, how it looks like, and all these ideas of copying and everything. And I'm also thinking, because the grassroots paper is very bottom up, I thought about how about looking at the Kenya Slum Upgrading Project, which sort of is not doing very well, but it's a more top-down approach towards a systemic or a holistic improvement of slums in Kenya, and it has its challenges. So that's it. Thank you. And
for me, it's a question about what policy or governmental interventions are sort of intervening within your research context, your research site. Are there governmental policies about sanitation support, or about the spreading of sanitary practices?
Okay. In Nairobi, for a long time, the government has neglected the slums, but in the recent times, there's more interest in informal settlements, and these are pushed by, for example, we have the new constitution of the Kenya has a new constitution where they say sanitation has to, be available for everyone. So these kind of new policies kind of motivated the government to think about the slums. And also, of course, over time, NGOs have been working to secure people from being evicted, so they're becoming more permanent. And with that, then the landscape, or rather the living environment, is already slum-like, but it's formalized. So they're already having the mandate to provide services. And the problem in the informal settlements is that until now, of course, the government is trying, but implementation of already existing policies, existing rules and regulations is a challenge because it's also neglected. So that's why people are kind of free to try whatever they want or to explore options. Yeah, and private sector is taking the space in a more formal way, more recently.
I think that she was before.
First, yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, first, Pauline, I wanted to say I really liked it, and I think it was a really nice and clear like story that we discussed. So well done. Yeah, I have a question. So could you elaborate a little bit on what practice theory is and how you use it?
Okay. Practice theory is it's a theory from social sciences that has existed for quite some time, and of course, when I was looking into the literature, and since into the sustainability transitions literature, and since the focus of my research is really on the everyday life, trying to kind of really understand how sanitation in the everyday life looks like and how that can inform changes, I came across the practice theory, and this theory is it's trying to detach the idea that the focus has to be on an object, but this like a material object like a toilet or I don't know any kind of material dimension, and to say that it exists in looking at practices, you're able to kind of understand more how these influences change processes, and it brings in the multidimensionality of people living their life and exploring resources, capabilities to be able to make decisions.
Okay, thanks.
Pauline, a really wonderful talk and interesting study. I was interested in your very thought-provoking idea of a splintered regime, and I wondered whether you could say a bit more about what you meant by that. And also, that is a question, you say you did work in 3 different communities.
Mm-hmm.
Are there differences in the way the routines of, are handled in those 3 communities, or actually do you see the same sort of level of disorganization and dynamics as you were describing it in your talk?
Yeah. To start with another page came up. That's my colleague. We're working together on that. The conceptualization of the splintered regime is, first of all, what exactly is a regime? And in sustainability transition, they say a regime is a set of institutionalized rules that govern for example, that govern it governs a system, and sort of it gives direction to how change happens, because it might lead to the persistence of specific rules and practices or change. And how we conceptualize the splintered regime is that, first of all, the reason why we came about with the idea of understanding the splintered regime is because, like I said, sustainability transition is very interesting because it has these envisioning forward-looking ideas. And when we applied it in our context, we found that already in literature, the regime is always defined as the regime is whatever is dominant, and then the other existing alternatives are niches, or the regime is always one. But in this context, like for example, I said in the informal settlement, you find the users have been the one providing services since independence, 50 years, yeah? And in Nairobi, 50% of Nairobians live in the slums. So we look at also these informal settlements as also regimes. We say they're regimes. So in this context, there's no really dominant regime. And what is most institutionalized, we look at it from an institutionalization perspective, is what is a regime. So here we say there are multiple regimes. And the splintering aspect is the idea that the regimes do not work together in congruence. Everyone is having their own visions and their own idea on how to improve the sanitation. Everyone have their own capabilities and capacities. And so we have this splitted regime that is, people are not working together, and with that it kind of does not help. They coexist, but it does not help. But who knows, perhaps there could be many regimes that work in congruence, and these might lead to better service access, and we conceptualize this as polycentric regime. And of course, there's the monolithic regime like in Europe, where the centralized system takes 95% of services. So that's how we kind of try to describe.
And just on the three different areas that you studied, are they all the same in the way the provisioning happens, or are they actually rather different? Are there different patterns in the three different places?
Actually, in the beginning, when I was thinking about looking at the infrastructure, I had the idea they're very different. But the moment you go into the everyday practice, you find like those navigating strategies, those coping strategies are quite similar across all the informal settlements. And I was also able to describe some dimensions that I thought were interesting to kind of, to kind of show the significance of some certain dimensions. And for example, you find Madare, where you'll be going, it's a very old slum from 1920. And there's, looking at the social dimension of this whole practice that I described, you find there is a very different dynamic because it's an old slum, people are very established, although they still don't own the land. And if you compare it with Mukuru, where it's much younger and people are more not very established and they're more interested in new innovations. And there are those social, for example, dimensions that come out. You find in the other slum, people already organize themselves much more stable options. So I was able to find some dimensions.